Canada just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the era of quiet deference to Washington is over. After a high-level virtual meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped in front of reporters and delivered a message that captured the country's new direction with stunning clarity.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for traveling around the world and getting Canada out front and making sure that we diversify our trade with other countries.
It wasn't a throwaway line. It was an unmistakable signal that even Ontario, the province most economically tied to the United States and usually the most cautious in moments of Canada-US tension, is now fully aligned with Carney's global pivot. At a time when Donald Trump's administration is imposing sweeping tariffs, freezing communication channels, and trying to pull allies back under American control, Ford's remarks confirmed something Washington hoped wasn't true. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States. It is rewriting its place in the world and winning partners Trump never expected Ottawa to secure. What Ford said wasn't just praise for a prime minister. It was an acknowledgement of a new Canadian strategy. Canada is stepping onto the world stage, deliberately, confidently, and independently.
The remarks came on November 17, 2025, after Carney met virtually with all provincial and territorial leaders to discuss the federal budget and the state of Canada's relationship with the United States. Ford described the meeting as positive and unusually frank, noting that communication between Ottawa and Washington has all but collapsed. Negotiators are still working behind the scenes, but official dialogue remains frozen after months of tariff escalation. Ford explained that while the United States has been pushing for a sector-by-sector negotiation model, focusing on autos, steel, and softwood lumber, Canada cannot afford to sit idle waiting for an American breakthrough. Trump's administration has repeatedly leveraged tariffs as political weapons, and Reuters recently confirmed that Trump publicly declared he would not restart trade talks with Canada after Ottawa's economic messaging campaign frustrated his inner circle. Against that backdrop, Carney briefed the premiers on his fast-paced diplomatic push overseas. From Asia to Europe and the Middle East, Canada has reopened channels, signed new agreements, and secured investment opportunities that simply were not accessible during the previous diplomatic freeze. Ford emphasized that these efforts are not symbolic. They're reshaping where Canada sells its goods, where it sources critical minerals, and where its economic partnerships will come from in the next decade. The meeting also included updates on domestic sectors under strain, including steel and autos, which continue to absorb pressure from U.S. tariffs.
Ford pressed for stronger protections and stricter quota management, arguing that Canada cannot be a dumping ground for low-cost global steel. Far more importantly, however, he highlighted the Prime Minister's broader strategy. Canada must strengthen itself at home while expanding its presence abroad. Ford's endorsement carried weight precisely because Ontario has historically been the province most intertwined with American supply chains. When a leader in that position says Canada must diversify, it reflects a major national consensus. The reality is simple. Canada can no longer afford to wait for the United States to resolve its internal chaos or clarify its trade objectives. Trump's tariff strategy has made unpredictability the new normal, and industries in Ontario have grown tired of operating in the shadow of U.S. political turbulence. Ford's remarks recognized a truth that Canadians have quietly understood for years but rarely said aloud. Canada has the talent, the resources, and the diplomatic capacity to stand on its own feet. Carney's strategy of traveling around the world is not about prestige, it is about securing alternatives so that when the United States slams a door, Canada does not stand stranded in the corridor.
Trump's trade war with Canada was designed to corner Ottawa into submission. Instead, it has triggered the opposite reaction. Companies in both countries are reassessing supply chains, and in some cases, shifting operations north to avoid American volatility. Farmers and manufacturers in the Midwest, many of whom helped elect Trump, are now facing higher costs because Canadian counter-tariffs have redirected supply flows across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Canada's outreach is earning tangible results. Carney's meeting with Xi Jinping produced the first thaw in Canada-China relations since 2018.
China invited Carney to Beijing for high-level talks in 2026, while Canada resumed cooperation in clean technology, tourism, and energy transition. In India, negotiations are restarting after years of political chill. Across ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, Canada is expanding trade, defense, and energy partnerships with countries eager to reduce their own dependence on Washington. What makes this pivot so powerful is that it was forced into motion by Trump himself. Faced with unpredictable tariffs and stalled negotiations, Canada did what middle powers do when global giants falter. It built a better set of options. Traveling around the world undersells the scope of the shift. Carney is not visiting capitals for ceremonial handshakes. He is redrawing Canada's economic architecture. His strategy connects new partners in critical minerals, LNG supply, nuclear technology, AI, advanced manufacturing, and clean electricity. These are the sectors that will define global leadership for the next 30 years, and Canada is anchoring itself inside that future. The United States, meanwhile, is retreating behind tariff walls. Trump's approach relies on coercion and intimidation. Carney's relies on diversification and cooperation. One closes markets, the other opens them. For decades, U.S. policymakers assumed Canada would remain loyal by default, even when mistreated. Trump pushed that assumption past its breaking point. Ford's comments show the American miscalculation. Canada was not drifting away. It was preparing its escape route. And now that escape route is becoming the foundation of a more independent, more confident Canadian identity. Doug Ford's endorsement of Carney's global trade offensive marks a defining moment in modern Canadian politics. It signals the emergence of a unified national strategy, one that protects Canada at home while building influence abroad. Trump's tariffs were meant to weaken Canada, but they accelerated the country's most significant economic realignment in decades. The question now is how far this transformation will go. Will Canada lean even more heavily into Asia and Europe? Will Trump attempt new forms of retaliation? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when Canada finally realized that it did not need permission from Washington to shape its own future? One thing is already clear. Canada has stepped onto the world stage, and this time it's standing there on its own terms.
This is Hanwha's KSS-3 submarine, launched into the sea just in time for the Prime Minister's visit. Mark Carney climbed down 7 meters to check out what the South Koreans want Canada to buy.
When you walk through the Hanwha Ocean Shipyard in South Korea, you can feel the weight of industry. Towering cranes, welding sparks, and steel hulls taking shape on the water. It is one of the largest shipyards in Asia, 5 square kilometers of pure precision and ambition. And in late October 2025, amid that metallic rhythm, one visitor stood out: Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Cameras followed him as he toured the submarine line that could soon redefine Canada's Navy. Hanwha Ocean is one of 2 finalists competing to replace Canada's aging Victoria-class submarines. The South Koreans promised 12 new KS-3 boats, 4 by 2035, if a deal is signed by 2026. That single image, Carney standing among South Korean engineers, carried more meaning than a press statement ever could. While Donald Trump was in another city, warning allies to buy American and tightening tariff walls, Carney was moving in the opposite direction. He was in Asia, exploring technology and partnerships the United States could no longer offer. For Canada, this wasn't just a defense procurement trip. It was a declaration of independence, an unmistakable signal that Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to modernize. The story behind Carney's visit runs deeper than submarines. It reflects a global realignment, now visible from Ottawa to Seoul. In recent years, South Korea has earned a new nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. Once a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, it is now on course to become the world's 4th largest weapons exporter. Korean firms have delivered artillery to Poland, tanks to Australia and air defense systems to NATO allies. Now, they are bidding to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a contract worth between 20 and 24 billion US dollars. What makes Seoul's offer so attractive is speed and partnership. The KS-3 submarines are already operational for the Korean Navy. They can be built within the next decade using advanced robotics and modular construction. The proposal even includes technology transfer, crew training, and the creation of maintenance facilities on Canadian soil. It's not a one-off transaction. Seoul's Deputy Defense Minister has called it a long-term partnership aimed at strengthening Canada's own defense industry. That approach stands in sharp contrast to traditional American deals, which often keep production and intellectual property inside the U.S. border. For Carney, the choice is symbolic. By engaging South Korea, Canada is signaling to the world and to Washington that it will not be confined to a single industrial orbit. It is building new supply chains and friendships in Asia, where technology and cooperation come without the constant shadow of tariffs and political strings. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has rebuilt his economic playbook around protectionism. Under the America First agenda, his administration has imposed sweeping import taxes ranging from 10 to 100%. Canada has been hit particularly hard, facing a 25% tariff on most industrial goods and an additional 10% on energy. For Ottawa, those measures have disrupted trade worth over $120 billion annually. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government chose a more strategic path. It began shifting Canada's defense and technology partnerships towards Asia, where nations like South Korea and Japan were eager to cooperate without political tension. That shift is not just economic. It's geopolitical. Every submarine Canada builds with Seoul, every maintenance contract it signs outside the U.S. is a quiet rebalance of power. It chips away at Washington's decades-long dominance over North American industry. In short, Trump's tariffs have accelerated exactly what he hoped to prevent: the diversification of Western allies away from U.S. factories. By pushing partners to the edge, the White House has forced them to find new routes, and Canada is proving that independence can be a strategy, not a risk. It's hard to miss the symbolism. At the end of October, both Donald Trump and Mark Carney were in South Korea, but for entirely different missions. Trump met President Lee Jae-myung to finalize a $350 billion U.S.-Korea trade framework focused on reshoring and tight supply chain control. Carney, meanwhile, visited GOJ, where Korean engineers built submarines for their own navy. Two Western leaders, one country, two opposite visions. Trump came to enforce American terms, Carney came to forge new ones. One relied on tariffs, the other on trust. This contrast captures the fracture in today's Western order. The old model, Washington dictates, allies follow, is breaking apart. Canada's outreach to South Korea represents a new approach, where middle powers collaborate directly and trade capability, not obedience. As Trump's motorcade departed Seoul, Carney's team entered Hanwha's shipyard. For historians, it might mark the week Canada stopped orbiting Washington and started steering its own course in Asia. A year ago, Canada seemed like a casualty of Trump's trade war. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber cut exports and threatened jobs. Economists warned of long-term damage. But by late 2025, the narrative has flipped. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Canada is rebuilding through new alliances. Deals with Japan, South Korea, and Australia now anchor its industrial strategy. Partnerships that share technology instead of imposing restrictions. The submarine talks are more than procurement. They represent who controls the engines of innovation. If the deal goes through, it will bring thousands of jobs, advanced robotics training, and new supply chain opportunities inside Canada. More importantly, it proves that Canada can prosper outside America's shadow. Trump's tariffs tried to isolate Ottawa, but instead propelled it toward a network of Asian democracies eager for cooperation. Government officials expect the first submarines by 2035, the same year the USMCA review is due. By then, Canada's defense network could stretch from Vancouver to Busan, not just from Ottawa to Washington. The message is clear. While the US builds walls, Canada builds bridges. Partnership has replaced dependency. Strategy has replaced fear. And as the clang of steel echoed through Hanwha's shipyard, it symbolized something larger than a contract, the moment a nation reclaimed control of its industrial future.
From afar, it might look like an ordinary diplomatic visit. But in the global story of 2025, Carney's stop in South Korea speaks volumes. It shows that alliances are shifting and that middle powers like Canada can redefine their destiny without waiting for Washington. In a world dominated by tariffs and trade wars, this submarine project isn't just about ships under the sea, it's about a country surfacing with a new sense of confidence. Because while others build barriers, Canada is quietly forging steel, and with it, a new path forward.
We can't do so without acknowledging the elephant in the room. President Trump continues to take direct aim at Canada. Well, he's going to really go after us now. I'm reading my speech. I just called him an elephant. But anyways, can't call that guy any name.
In a crowded ballroom at Toronto's Empire Club, Ontario Premier Doug Ford paused, smiled, and mentioned the elephant in the room. The audience laughed, but the message was unmistakable. For months, President Trump's latest tariff wave had unsettled both sides of the border. Duties on steel, autos, aluminum, lumber, even critical minerals. Washington called it strength. Ottawa called it provocation. Ford turned a luncheon into a defining moment. He told business leaders that Ontario would not be pushed around by U.S. policy. The mood changed instantly. What began as a light remark became a signal that Canada was ready to fight back. Trump's 2025 tariff expansion touched nearly every industry that links the two economies. Steel and aluminum face new surcharges. Auto parts, once exempt, were suddenly taxed. Furniture, copper, and heavy trucks joined the list. Even film and semiconductor manufacturing fell under Washington's widening national security umbrella. For Canada, the effect was immediate. Ontario alone exports more than $80 billion worth of manufactured goods to the United States each year. Every new duty squeezed margins and threatened factory jobs from Windsor to Hamilton. Ford's speech marked a turning point. He described these measures as a tax on a partner, not on a rival, and he acted before Ottawa could. Ontario introduced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, a signal that the province would no longer stay silent. At the same time, Queen's Park launched a $75 million Canadian dollar campaign built around Ronald Reagan's old warning against protectionism, running in both Canadian and U.S. markets. For Ford, it was as much about livelihoods as politics. Ontario's industrial belt depends on cross-border trade. His voters see the impact of every plant closure. Taking a stand wasn't symbolism, it was survival. Trump's plan sought to pull production back to America, but by October 2025, it was producing the opposite effect. Canadian manufacturers began investing in domestic supply chains. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce reported a 12% rise in new industrial permits during the third quarter, driven by steel finishing, auto components, and clean energy materials. Export Development Canada noted that more firms were seeking insurance and credit for European clients, reducing dependence on U.S. orders. Instead of weakening Canada, the tariffs pushed it toward greater self-reliance. In his address, Ford framed Ontario as capable of becoming one of the richest and most secure regions in the world if it harnessed its own talent and resources. Behind the optimism was calculation. By taxing electricity exports and promoting Made in Ontario, Ford leveraged the sectors where his province holds real power: energy, minerals, and advanced manufacturing. Analysts estimated Ontario's grid supplied roughly 6% of New York State's demand in 2024. Even a small surcharge reminded U.S. states how deeply their economies depend on Canadian energy. Meanwhile, data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showed a 5-month decline in manufacturing employment through September 2025, with 78,000 fewer factory jobs than a year earlier. Ontario's policy response also had a psychological effect. Business confidence surveys by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business showed a steady climb through late 2025, reversing months of uncertainty. Companies that once delayed investment decisions began accelerating production to meet new domestic contracts, especially in transportation equipment and battery materials. The Ontario government set up a new task force connecting auto suppliers with provincial mining firms to ensure stable access to nickel, lithium, and copper, key components for EV manufacturing. These moves transformed the tariff shock into a catalyst for industrial planning. The shift may be modest in numbers today, but symbolically, it marked the rebirth of economic nationalism on Canadian terms. The irony was clear. A policy meant to protect American workers was beginning to erode their industries, exactly the kind of reversal Ford had warned about.
The echo echoed far beyond Toronto. In Washington, officials were surprised not by Ottawa's diplomats, but by a provincial premier speaking directly to U.S. power. Regional leaders along the border quickly noticed. Governors from manufacturing states voiced concern about higher electricity prices and supply chain delays. Industry groups in the Great Lakes region called for clarity on tariffs, saying the back-and-forth measures were disrupting deliveries of parts and materials. Trump, accustomed to controlling every headline, suddenly faced a story he didn't script: a Canadian leader challenging his policy head-on. It underscored a shift among U.S. allies who have grown weary of uncertainty. In Europe, Japan, and South Korea, governments had already signed sectoral trade frameworks, setting tariff caps at 15%. Canada, bound by geography and supply chains, had less flexibility, until Ontario forced the issue. By standing firm, Ford reframed the conversation. Rather than pleading for relief, Canada was now seen as the steady player defending predictable rules in North American commerce.
As the applause faded in the Empire Club ballroom, one thing was clear: the tone of Canada's relationship with Washington had changed. Ford's humor, his Reagan references, and his direct language toward Trump all served a purpose: to announce that Ontario would defend its economy on its own terms. The months ahead will test whether that strategy holds. The electricity surcharge, the advertising campaign, and the surge in local investment all signal a broader shift toward economic independence inside a volatile North American market. For the United States, the lesson is the same one history keeps repeating. Tariffs can buy leverage, but they can also breed isolation. When partners start protecting themselves instead of cooperating, the costs multiply on both sides of the border. What began as a push to reindustrialize America has instead encouraged Canada to do the same, not out of rivalry, but out of necessity. Ford's speech was more than a rebuttal. It was a turning point. Trump's tariff strategy aimed to reassert dominance. Instead, it awakened a new assertiveness in Canada, one that no longer fears the elephant in the room.
Looking around the world now, you've got China sort of playing by its own playbook economically. You have the U.S. playing by its own playbook, ignoring various agreements, including at times USMCA. What does that mean for the rules-based system for a middle power like Canada?
At the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a message that left many in Washington unsettled.
And nobody's perfect in this. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we're re-engaging with China and other major economies in terms of developing the rules bilaterally with them.
He announced that Canada would re-engage with China, seeking to establish a new framework for bilateral rules. This declaration landed just as the United States, under President Trump, has extended its reciprocal tariff regime to every major trading partner, including Canada. The tariffs were meant to force others into accepting America's terms. Yet Carney signaled that Canada was ready to chart its own path. Instead of bowing to pressure, Ottawa is turning outward, searching for new alliances and new leverage. The story begins with a clash of visions. Trump builds walls of tariffs. Carney opens doors to alternative partners. That contrast sets the stage for what comes next.
Carney made clear that both Washington and Beijing are playing by their own rulebooks. For Canada, that reality means waiting for others to return to multilateral discipline is no longer an option. Ottawa will now attempt to develop direct rules with China, recognizing the risks but also the opportunities of engaging the world's second-largest economy. Sensitive areas such as national security and data privacy will remain closed. Yet Canada intends to carve out a controlled space for trade and cooperation. This is not surrender, but calculation. With Trump escalating confrontation and tariffs disrupting steel, autos, and farm products, Carney has decided that Canada must place a chip on every table. The re-engagement with China is meant to give Ottawa more balance and more say, even if it means moving in a direction opposite to Washington. This step is designed to give Canada breathing room at a time when U.S. trade actions are tightening around all partners. Carney also reminded his audience that Canada already holds positions in two of the world's largest rules-based systems, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, known as CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. These agreements include standards for labor and sustainability, the kind of provisions that are recognizable and enforceable. By being part of both, Ottawa can serve as a bridge between Europe and Asia. The United States, by contrast, has stepped away. Trump pulled America out of the original TPP and has repeatedly ignored commitments under USMCA. Carney's point was not hidden. Canada is investing in systems where rules matter, while Washington sidelines itself. As those networks expand, America risks becoming the bystander. Ottawa is signaling that its future will not be locked inside Trump's tariff cage. Instead, Canada is building the kind of international bridges that leave Washington outside the room when new rules are written. Carney did not deny Canada's vulnerability. Nearly 80% of Canadian trade still flows south into the United States. But he emphasized the importance of what he called the growth at the margin. New trade with Europe, with CPTPP countries, and with China can shift the balance over time. Even small increases in those directions can change the outlook for industries battered by tariffs. Trump's reciprocal tariffs, meant to squeeze, are creating the incentive for Canada to move elsewhere. The backfire is clear. Instead of reinforcing dependence, the policy has accelerated diversification. Canada is showing that it can step out of America's shadow and place itself in the center of a different global map. The contrast could not be sharper. Trump designed his tariff regime to keep Canada in line, but Carney's new approach flips that logic. By re-engaging with China and doubling down on Europe and Asia, Ottawa is no longer asking Washington for permission. Canada is signaling that it has options and that the United States is not the only game in town. This is the image that left Trump stunned, watching as his neighbor quietly walked out of the cage he built. That is why Carney's words in New York carried such weight. Trump sought to lock Canada in. Ottawa has walked out, leaving the U.S. president stunned as his northern neighbor rewrites the script of survival and influence.
Prime Minister Mark Carney's list of nation-building projects has been released. It includes a liquefied natural gas or LNG expansion project, and here on the East Coast, a major wind energy project.
They recognize that Nova Scotia can contribute to the goal of making Canada an energy superpower with our wind project. The offshore wind potential we have is so incredible.
It was announced as a nation-building moment.
Prime Minister Mark Carney placed the Wind West offshore wind project on Canada's list of projects of national interest, and Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston called it a big day for the province and for the country. The scale is unlike anything Canada has attempted in clean energy before. The first phase alone is planned at 5,000 megawatts, generating about 24 terawatt-hours of electricity each year. The full offshore potential is far greater, reaching 40 to 60 gigawatts, while Nova Scotia itself only consumes 2 to 3. That means the province is looking at a resource that could power multiple provinces or entire regions of the United States. At its core, Wind West is not just another renewable project. It is being sold as a pillar of Canada's ambition to become an energy superpower. For Nova Scotia, it is the chance to anchor new industries, from ports to manufacturing, while showing that the Atlantic coast can deliver the same scale of energy development long associated with Western oil and gas. Domestically, the benefits are clear. The project is expected to attract tens of billions of Canadian dollars in private investment and create thousands of jobs during construction and operation. From engineers to tradespeople, the opportunities cut across the economy. Nova Scotia's offshore wind speeds are about 10% stronger than those in the North Sea, giving the province a natural advantage. Harnessing this potential strengthens Canada's energy security and builds the foundation for new exports, from electricity to green hydrogen. Most importantly, production will far exceed local demand, ensuring that surplus energy becomes an instrument of national leverage.
Produce over 40, 50, 60 gigawatts of clean green energy offshore in Nova Scotia, and we only use 2 to 3. So when you produce that much, you need to have a market for the rest. So that means, you need to be able to transmit it and sell it to other markets, maybe in Quebec or Ontario or beyond.
Nova Scotia consumes only a fraction of the energy Wind West could deliver. Even after domestic needs are met, more than 90% of the output could be directed outward. Transmission is already part of the plan. The New England Clean Energy Connect line, a 1,200-megawatt high-voltage link from Quebec to Maine, is expected to enter service by late 2025. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia utilities are also preparing a new 345-kilovolt connection to move power south. The United States is the natural buyer. ISO New England data shows the region has been a net importer of electricity for years, with flows from Quebec and New Brunswick providing a buffer when local plants shut down or when natural gas prices spike. Coal units are being retired, gas remains volatile, and demand for low-carbon supply is rising. In this environment, offshore wind from Atlantic Canada is not a luxury. It is a direct complement to hydro imports from Quebec, filling gaps and providing stability to a system that cannot generate enough power within its own borders. This is where U.S. politics collide with energy reality. President Donald Trump has imposed global tariffs between 10 and 50% and threatened a 100% tariff on imported semiconductors. Canada has been a central target, facing high duties on steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. Yet the same United States that pressures Canada on trade is also short of power. Dominion Energy projects that regional electricity demand could double within 15 years, driven by artificial intelligence and data centers. Wholesale prices in New England are already climbing as supply struggles to keep pace. That is why Canadian electricity is not optional. It is the stabilizer that keeps American grids reliable. Wind West will expand that role. Canada is positioned to deliver the clean power the U.S. economy requires at the very moment when tariffs are supposed to reduce Canadian influence. Policies designed to pressure Canada may backfire, because Washington cannot easily replace the energy lifeline that flows across the border. For Canada, Wind West is both a domestic achievement and an international bargaining chip. For the United States, it is a reminder that trade disputes cannot erase geography or the physics of energy supply. In the years ahead, the turbines rising off Nova Scotia's coast may prove to be more than just a symbol of green ambition. They may be the reason America cannot fully escape its dependence on Canadian energy.